He wore an old field jacket, pushed a supply cart, and kept his eyes down. To everyone on base, he was just the quiet janitor with a tired face and a soldier's posture. But when the SEAL Admiral jokingly asked him for his call sign, and he calmly replied, "Iron Ghost," the entire room fell silent. The Admiral dropped his glass, and the legend no one dared to speak of had just walked out of the shadows. Who was this man? Why did the most elite warriors whisper his name? And why did the Admiral, once a lion, suddenly look like he'd seen a ghost? The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific like a pale curtain, softening the jagged outlines of the training structures at the Coronado Naval Amphibious Base. Steel ladders glistened with dew. Ropes swung gently in the salt-tinged breeze. Young SEAL candidates, lean and restless, jogged in formation across the grinder, their boots striking the asphalt in perfect unison. Commands barked out sharp as gunfire. The place hummed with discipline, pride, and a little arrogance, an atmosphere built on tradition and competition. On the far edge of the parade ground, near a stack of supply crates, stood a man who didn't belong. Michael Trace looked like someone's older brother who had wandered into the wrong movie set. His hair, dark brown threaded with early streaks of gray, fell just long enough to curl at his collar. He wore a faded olive-green field jacket, whose elbows had thinned to a lighter shade, and on his feet, scuffed work boots instead of regulation black. A laminated badge hung from his belt, contractor facilities and logistics. In one hand, he held a clipboard. In the other, a box of replacement water filters. He wasn't moving like a janitor, though. Even standing still, there was a coiled precision in his posture, the kind of quiet readiness that doesn't need to announce itself. His eyes, gray-green like weathered steel, swept the training field without judgment or envy. It was the look of a man who had seen everything once and learned to keep it to himself. A group of candidates jogging past slowed their stride as they noticed him. Some smirked. To them, he was the guy who mopped the hallways at night, the man who changed out the filters and tightened the squeaky doors. They didn't know why his boots looked military-issue or why his jacket had the ghost of a name tape stitched over the pocket. They didn't ask. In a place like Coronado, you didn't ask about outsiders. Up on the reviewing platform stood Admiral Andrew Keaton, his uniform crisp and heavy with ribbons. The 4 stars on his collar gleamed like small suns. At 55, Keaton was still broad-shouldered, with the square-cut jaw of a recruitment poster and the confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades in command. He leaned on the railing, surveying his domain with practiced detachment. When his gaze drifted to the supply crates, it stopped. There was something about the janitor. Keaton frowned, then allowed a small, dismissive smile to tug at the corner of his mouth. Another civilian contractor trying to look tough, he thought. The base had been crawling with them since the new training program expanded. But the man's stance, the set of his shoulders, it was irritatingly familiar. Like a name on the tip of your tongue. Keaton, one of the instructors, called up to him, but the Admiral raised a hand for silence. His eyes stayed locked on the man in the old jacket. Below, the contractor adjusted a box on the dolly and started to push it toward the mess hall, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who never wasted energy. Not a glance upward. Not a sign he'd noticed the Admiral's stare. Keaton's curiosity shifted to something else, the urge to puncture. Around here, rank gave you the right to test people, and Keaton had always been good at drawing a laugh from his men, especially at someone else's expense. By noon, the sun had burned away the fog, leaving a sky so blue it felt like polished glass. Inside the main hall, long tables had been set for a mid-cycle briefing. Candidates lined up boots, squeaking chatter low. Keaton entered, last trailed by his senior instructors. Conversations died down. He exuded command like heat. At the far end, near the supply door, Michael Trace was restocking bottled water in the cooler. The jacket looked even older under fluorescent light. Sweat darkened his collar, but not his expression. His movements were methodical, silent. Keaton's voice carried across the hall. "Hey there, contractor." A few heads turned. Michael looked up slowly. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "You're here more than some of my recruits. Must be picking up a few tricks, huh?" Keaton's grin widened. The candidates tittered. The Admiral gestured at the jacket. "That thing's a relic. Bet you found it in a surplus store." Michael didn't answer. He closed the cooler door and straightened his clipboard tucked under his arm. The hall waited for him to mumble something and retreat, but he didn't move. Keaton took a step closer, enjoying the attention. "Tell me, janitor," he said, each word like a pebble skipping across water. "Every SEAL worth his salt has a call sign, even our instructors. What's yours?" The question hung in the air, casual on the surface, but cutting underneath. Laughter rippled through the candidates. A few glanced at Michael with mild pity. He looked like he'd been put on the spot like any working man caught in front of a microphone. Yet his eyes, gray-green and unreadable, didn't flinch. For a heartbeat, he seemed to weigh his options. Then he spoke. "Iron Ghost." 2 words spoken without drama. But the effect was instantaneous. The room's murmur stopped. Chairs scraped as men shifted in their seats. Someone dropped a metal cup. It clanged loudly against the tile. And Admiral Keaton, whose name was synonymous with composure, felt his hand tremble. The glass of iced tea he was holding slipped, shattering against the floor. Liquid splashed dark across his polished boots. Nobody laughed now. The hall was suddenly too quiet, like the ocean before a wave breaks. Michael Trace didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't explain. He simply set the clipboard on the table, picked up the empty carton he'd brought, and walked toward the exit with the same unhurried gait he'd arrived with. As he passed the rows of young SEALs, several craned their necks to follow him, expressions shifting from amusement to something like awe or fear. At the door, he paused just long enough to meet Admiral Keaton's eyes. For an instant, something flickered there, a history neither of them had spoken of, yet a battlefield memory sealed under classified orders. Then Michael stepped outside into the sunlight, leaving the hall hushed behind him. Keaton stood frozen shards of glass at his feet. The name echoed in his head like a detonated charge, Iron Ghost. 7 years ago, halfway across the world, a shadow unit had pulled off an impossible extraction under fire. The operations files had been sealed above his clearance. But the rumors. God, the rumors about a man who appeared out of nowhere, saved a trapped SEAL team, then vanished. They'd called him a phantom, a myth. And now the myth had just walked past him carrying a box of water filters. Keaton swallowed hard, trying to recover his composure. Around him, the candidates whispered. A legend had entered their house disguised as a janitor, and the Admiral had been the one to call him out. Outside, the sunlight glinted off Michael Trace's jacket as he loaded the dolly back onto his truck. He didn't look back. His face remained calm, but inside an old ache stirred the knowledge that ghosts don't stay hidden forever. He had come here for quiet work and a paycheck, nothing more. Yet with 2 simple words, the past had cracked open. Somewhere deep inside, Michael felt the weight shift. The story he had kept buried was no longer entirely his. The young eyes watching him now would search whisper dig. And the man who had once commanded him would have to decide what to do with the truth. For Michael Trace, the old jacket was no disguise. It was armor worn thin but still holding. He pushed the dolly into the truck bed, the ocean wind tugging at his hair, and thought of the promise he'd made to himself years ago. Never stand in the spotlight. Let the work speak for itself. But the spotlight had found him anyway. Above the base, a gull wheeled and cried out, its shadow sliding over the parade ground. Inside the hall, Admiral Andrew Keaton stared at the door long after Michael had gone, the echo of Iron Ghost ringing in his ears, like a bell he couldn't unhear. And somewhere in the rows of candidates, a young SEAL named Timothy Cole leaned forward, his heart beating faster. He didn't know why yet, but he was certain of one thing: this was not the last time he'd hear that name. Lunch hour at the Coronado training base was usually a storm of noise boots, stomping trays, clattering conversations, bouncing off steel beams. But that day, as the men filed into the mess hall, there was a strange hush in the air, like static before a thunderclap. It had been 3 hours since the name Iron Ghost dropped like a depth charge in the main briefing hall, and yet the ripples hadn't stopped spreading. No one knew what to say, only that something had shifted. A myth had stepped out of the shadows, and now everyone was walking a little differently. Even the loudest SEAL candidates found themselves whispering without realizing it. Timothy Cole couldn't stop thinking about the moment. He was one of the youngest in his group, 26, fresh from top marks in Bud S. Sharp-Minded, and still clinging to that restless eagerness to prove himself. But what he'd witnessed earlier had shaken something in him. It wasn't just the call sign. It was the way the man had stood there, unmoving, unbothered, while everyone else unraveled. Tim sat now near the back of the mess hall, poking at his potatoes, eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. He wasn't alone. Others were doing the same. They were all waiting. At exactly 12:27 p.m., the side door swung open. Michael Trace stepped inside carrying a new box of kitchen filters. He was back in that same weathered jacket, khaki pants, dusted with sand, at the cuffs clipboard under one arm. He looked like he always did, invisible by design. But this time, no one saw a janitor. He hadn't taken 5 steps before heads began to turn subtly at first. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered in the air. One recruit stood up unconsciously, then sat down again, embarrassed. Even the head chef peeked out from the kitchen window. And then there was Admiral Andrew Keaton seated at the long officer's table near the center of the room. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white. He hadn't said a word since the incident that morning, and the silence was beginning to chew at him. Iron Ghost. The name was haunting him. It had opened a door in his memory he had fought to keep closed. He forced a smirk onto his face as he saw Michael approach. If he wants to play mysterious, fine. But not on my base, not without consequence. Keaton stood his chair, scraping loud across the floor. The hall fell completely still. "Mr. Trace," he called out loud and casual, but with an unmistakable edge. Michael didn't slow. "Sir," he acknowledged calmly, barely inclining his head. Keaton grinned wider. "Got a question for you. You told us your call sign this morning. Mind telling us what it means?" "Iron Ghost, was it?" Michael stopped. The box of filters rested against his hip clipboard, still tucked beneath his elbow. He looked at the Admiral with a gaze that was neither hostile nor amused, just quietly resolute. "It was given to me," he said. "I never asked what it meant." Laughter tried to rise in the room but caught in people's throats. The Admiral chuckled too hard, trying to recover control. "Come on, every call sign's got a story. Hell, mine was backstop. Want to know why he didn't wait for a response? Because I always made sure no one behind me ever got hit. You don't get a name like Iron Ghost for changing air filters." That stung. It was meant to. But Michael didn't flinch. I suppose he said slowly, "Some stories are given to you when people don't expect you to survive them." It was quiet again. The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Keaton's smirk faltered. "So where exactly did you earn that name, Mr. Trace?" "Any of the men here can find out, you know. We've got clearance." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Not all of you." There was an audible intake of breath from one of the instructors. Tim's heart raced. The Admiral stepped forward, dropping the friendly pretense. "I don't like games on my base. You want to walk around playing war hero, I suggest you bring paperwork." Michael's voice was calm but colder now. Respectfully, "Admiral, I'm not playing anything." And then he did something that no one expected. He set the box of filters gently on the floor, took off his clipboard, and stood fully upright. In that moment, something changed. His posture transformed, not the slouch of a contractor lugging supplies, but the upright stillness of a soldier, trained to read wind speed through instinct, who knew the range of a glance and the weight of silence. His shoulders squared, his jaw, set not defiant, but undeniable. Every man in the room saw it now. They saw the truth. Michael didn't have to prove who he was. His presence had already done it. Then softly, almost like an afterthought, he added, "There's a reason you've never read my file, sir. Some stories aren't in your jurisdiction." Keaton's face flushed. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Around him, the room was watching. Officers, instructors, SEALs. And Michael Trace Iron Ghost wasn't backing down. At the far end of the table, Tim Cole felt something stir in his chest. He didn't know what the man had done, but every part of him believed it had been great and dark and hard-earned. And for the first time since entering the program, Tim realized how little he actually knew about the men who carried the weight of service long after the metal stopped shining. Michael picked up the box again, calmly, and walked past the Admiral. Just before the door, he paused. "You want to test me, Admiral," he said, without turning. "Do it on the field. Otherwise, I've got work to do." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Keaton remained standing, his hands shaking ever so slightly. He knew now. He didn't need the paperwork. He knew who Michael Trace was, and he was terrified of what might happen if the rest of the base found out too. In the silence that followed, Tim Cole reached for his tablet and began to type quietly. He was going to find out the truth, whatever it took. The legend didn't spread like wildfire. It spread like fog. In the days following the mess hall confrontation, Michael Trace's name, well, not his name, but his call sign echoed through the corridors across sand pits, inside gyms and gear rooms. Iron Ghost. Spoken quietly, uncertainly, like an old myth someone remembered half correct. It was never brought up in front of instructors. Not out loud. Not yet. But behind closed doors, SEAL candidates speculated like schoolboys trading stories around a campfire. Who was that man? Why had Admiral Keaton gone so pale? Why was his file restricted even to upper command? And most urgently, what the hell had he done to earn that call sign? Timothy Cole didn't join the rumors. He was too busy chasing the truth. Each night after lights out, while others collapsed in their bunks, Tim slipped into the resource center with a burner tablet he'd registered under a dummy name. He combed through declassified after-action reports, SEAL citations, retired personnel logs, anything that might contain even a whisper of Iron Ghost. At first there was nothing. The name didn't appear in any official roster. But on the fourth night, in the footnotes of an old op report buried inside a redacted account of a failed rescue in eastern Syria, he found it. Subject extraction executed by unknown operator, matching Iron Ghost profile. Mission deemed impossible. 0 casualties among extraction targets. Evac secured under direct fire. No body cam, no flight log. Entry and exit undocumented. Operator vanished post-exfil. No name, no photo. Just a title, Operation Night Candle, classified level 7. Commander listed as unavailable. Tim stared at the screen long after the lights of the building flickered into standby mode. The story was only 3 sentences long, but it rattled like thunder. Michael Trace wasn't just a janitor. He wasn't even just a SEAL. He was a ghost, pulled from the darkest corner of the military's playbook, the kind of man the Navy didn't talk about, because they weren't supposed to exist. The next morning, Tim couldn't stop glancing across the training yard. Michael was there again, moving boxes from a delivery truck into the quartermaster's shed. Same old jacket, same work boots, same quiet stride. But Tim saw everything differently now. The way he avoided eye contact, but always knew who was watching. The way he moved, shoulders never tense, but always aligned to an exit. The way he listened, even when pretending not to. It wasn't what Michael said. It was what he withheld. And to Tim, that silence felt like its own language. Across the yard, some of the other recruits watched too, but they watched with nervous respect now. No one mocked him anymore. The laughter from a few days ago had withered, replaced by careful distance. Yet some still doubted. That afternoon, during a break from CQB drills, a broad-shouldered recruit named Austin Myers scoffed, "You're all acting like that guy's Jason Bourne." Another recruit muttered, "Yeah, but didn't you see the Admiral's face?" Myers grunted. "So, maybe the Admiral just dropped his drink. Doesn't make this guy some secret war hero." Tim clenched his jaw. "You think a civilian gets clearance to walk around a SEAL base without a full background check?" Myers shrugged. "Could have been a fluke. Or he's just another burnout who used to be someone and got kicked out. Now he's changing filters." Tim leaned in, voice low. "There's a mission on record classified above Admiral Keaton's level. A team was saved by someone who wasn't listed. Only 2 words in the whole report, Iron Ghost." Myers laughed once nervously. "You made that up." Tim pulled up the screenshot on his tablet. He didn't need to say a word. The group leaned over, reading in silence. When they looked up, something had changed in their expressions. No one said another word about it that day. That night, as the base settled into sleep, Michael Trace sat alone near the docks, his legs dangling off the edge, a coffee thermos in hand. The moon cast a silver ribbon across the dark water. He didn't need a calendar to know what day it was. October 11th, the day 7 years ago when he'd gone dark, the night they lost communications, the night the extraction team failed, the night he'd broken orders, crossed a border, and disappeared into hell to bring his brothers home. He'd emerged with a limp, 2 scars, and a silence that no metal could ever address. They told him afterward that if he agreed to let the mission stay sealed, he'd never have to explain. He could retire, live quietly, take a new name if he wanted. He didn't. He kept his name. And the silence. It was never about recognition. Never about revenge. It was about keeping them safe, the men he pulled out of fire, and the ones still fighting. But now the silence was cracking. Eyes were watching again. Footsteps approached. Michael didn't turn. He already knew who it was. "Evening, Cole," he said. Tim stopped a few feet away, startled. "How did you?" Michael finally glanced over. "You walk like you think no one can hear you. That's the loudest kind." Tim offered a sheepish smile and sat beside him. They stared at the water. "I read about Night Candle," Tim said quietly. Michael didn't respond. "I know it was you," Tim continued, "and I think others are starting to figure it out too." Michael sipped his coffee. "They won't find anything else. The rest of it's sealed." Tim hesitated. "Why stay here then? Why not disappear again?" Michael looked out at the sea, his voice low. "Because there are still kids out there who think being strong means being loud. That leadership is about barking orders and swinging rank. And someday one of them is going to walk into something he's not ready for and freeze." He turned to Tim, eyes steady. "If I can show just one of them what quiet strength looks like, maybe that's enough." Tim swallowed hard. In that moment, he didn't see a janitor or a ghost. He saw a man carrying the weight of 7 unspoken years with grace. "I won't tell anyone," Tim said. Michael nodded once. "I know." They sat there for a long time, 2 silhouettes under the stars, teacher and student, not by rank or assignment, but by something older, something earned. Far off, the wind picked up across the water, rustling the flags along the pier. And deep inside the Coronado compound, the whispers of a legend continued to move. Not loud, not proud, but inevitable. The Pacific stretched wide and endless, its surface rippling with sunlight like polished armor. Off the coast of Coronado, two RHIB's rigid-hulled inflatable boats sliced across the water, bouncing over waves with military precision. SEAL candidates gripped the sides tightly, eyes squinting beneath the salt spray. This was no ordinary training drill. This one had been added last minute, and it wasn't in the schedule. Michael Trace didn't belong on the boat. He wasn't on the roster. He didn't even have a training uniform. But someone no one quite knew who had logged him in as a maintenance observer for the day's water navigation exercise. Just routine oversight, they said. Help carry supplies, sit in the back. He'd seen the names. He'd seen the smirks from the logistics officers, and he'd recognized the weight in the gear bags. Too heavy, mismatched. He'd said nothing. Now wind tearing at his jacket, salt clinging to his skin. Michael crouched low near the stern eyes, scanning the water and the faces around him. The recruits were too focused to notice the details. But Michael saw the shift in the port side RHIB, sluggish in the turns, a hitch in the motor's hum, and the faintest tilt to the deck. He knew sabotage when he saw it, because he'd been trained to plant it himself. "Boat 2 is drifting," the instructor barked over the radio. No radio response came the reply. "Circle back. Trace stay with Boat 1. Michael didn't respond. He stood in a fluid motion and vaulted to the other boat as it bucked on a wave. The recruits gasped. Most couldn't have made that leap without training gear, but Michael landed with perfect balance. He dropped to one knee, checking the ballast panel, the steering column, and then without warning, he reached overboard and yanked hard at the safety line. It snapped off in his hand. The boat tilted hard. Left panic rippled across the recruits. Two men slipped nearly overboard. Another screamed, "Something's wrong with the stern." Michael was already in motion. He stripped his jacket in one fluid motion, kicked off his boots, and dove into the ocean. The water hit him like a cold slap, but it grounded him. His eyes opened beneath the surface, green-gray piercing through the blur. He moved fast, cutting through the water, like a blade kicking toward the keel. He saw the problem immediately. The trim tab was deliberately jammed with a block of rubber sealant, and an additional weight, meant to unbalance the hull, was wired to the transom. Not a beginner's prank. Someone had tried to make it look like maintenance error. With a flick of his knife always strapped under the waistband, Michael cut the wire, dislodged the block, and gave the rudder a hard twist to test mobility. It moved freely now. He surfaced, sucked in air, and climbed back on board, with the kind of quiet effortlessness that made even the cockiest recruits fall silent. "I want every man back on position," Michael barked, suddenly commanding. The instructor gaped. "You're not." But the words dried in his mouth. Michael's tone wasn't aggressive. It was precise, sharpened by years of experience. He pointed to the starboard, directing the recruits to redistribute their weight, and manually adjusted the heading. The boat steadied. The panic faded. The recruits obeyed instinctively without questioning why. Michael didn't wait for approval. He stood soaked and calm as the RHIB turned smoothly back toward shore. From the command tower, Admiral Andrew Keaton watched it all unfold through high-powered binoculars. He'd been informed earlier that Michael had been accidentally added to the rotation. He hadn't ordered it, but he hadn't stopped it either. Let the man get rattled, he'd thought. Let him fumble and fall. Then we'll see how real this iron ghost story is. But what he saw now made his stomach churn. Michael had not only spotted the sabotage, he'd fixed it underwater, rebalanced the crew, and brought the boat home without a scratch. No shouting, no panic, just decisive action. And now, as the boats approached the dock, Keaton could see the recruits looking at Michael not with suspicion, but with respect. Too much respect. By the time the RHIBs returned to port, the whispers had turned into quiet reverence. No one said it out loud, but the recruits were talking with their eyes. That man isn't just staff. He's something else. Tim Cole stepped off the boat boots, hitting the dock hard. He hadn't known Michael would be part of the drill. But when he saw him dive without hesitation, when he saw the problem solved before anyone else even understood it, he knew. This wasn't training. This was a reminder. Michael Trace had once commanded fear and awe on real battlefields, and now he was walking among them like a ghost who refused to rest. That night, Tim couldn't sleep. He sat in the common area, flipping through his notes, scrolling back to the Operation Night Candle excerpt. He knew in his gut now it wasn't just legend, it was fact. But something else bothered him more. Someone had tried to sabotage the drill, and that someone had chosen the boat Michael would be on. Tim's jaw clenched. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a matter of justice. The next morning, Michael walked through the maintenance bay as if nothing had happened. His jacket was dry again, his boots polished. The recruits nodded respectfully as he passed. One even stood a little straighter. He noticed, but didn't react. In his mind, he replayed the dive the way the wires had been twisted, not sloppy, not random. Someone had been testing him, or trying to break him, but they had underestimated something critical. Michael Trace didn't break. He adapted, and he remembered everything. As he reached the back of the supply hall, he paused by a metal locker. Tucked deep behind the hinge was a scrap of black tape barely visible. He peeled it off and stared. A number had been etched beneath it, 152. Michael exhaled slowly. Room 117, the operations control hub. Restricted access. So this wasn't just about pride anymore. It was a message. Someone in the command structure was afraid of what he represented. And that meant one thing. They remembered exactly who Iron Ghost was. And they wanted him buried again. Admiral Andrew Keaton had never been a man who lost sleep. Not through war zones, not through decades of deployments, not even during the night he was pulled from a crumbling safe house in Syria, with bullets snapping past his ears. But now, lying rigid in the captain's quarters of his Coronado residence, the Admiral stared at the ceiling as the clock ticked past. 4:14 a.m. The house was silent, yet his thoughts roared. Iron Ghost. He mouthed the name again, barely whispering it into the dark, like a curse he wasn't supposed to say out loud. Every instinct in him, every command lesson, every power dynamic he had ever mastered, told him one thing: Michael Trace was a threat. Not the kind that carried a weapon. Worse, he was the kind that carried truth. The kind that didn't need to raise his voice to undermine you. Keaton had built his reputation on command, presence, polish. He was the face of Navy precision, decorated, obeyed, untouchable. But now in break rooms and bunk lines, recruits whispered about a man in a field jacket with no rank on his shoulder. A man who moved like the sea itself, unpredictable, unstoppable. Michael Trace was stealing his house from under him, and the Admiral couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't unintentional. At 0700 hours, sharp Keaton entered the operations center with a stack of documents clutched in one hand and an expression like carved granite. Inside, 3 intelligence officers stood at attention. They had been summoned on short notice. He dropped the files on the table. I want everything you can pull on Michael Trace. Service records, disciplinary history, medical leaves reassignments. If he once sneezed near a Pentagon gate, I want to know the strain. One officer cleared her throat. Sir, we've already pulled what we could. His service record cuts off 7 years ago. After that, nothing but a reassignment to civilian contractor. No destination. Keaton's voice dropped to a razor's edge. That's not an oversight. That's a cover. They said nothing, but they all thought the same thing. He's right. Meanwhile, on the other side of the base, Michael moved with the rhythm of routine. He scrubbed grease from under a broken mess hall sink, replaced a torn cargo net in the climbing tower, calibrated a water filtration sensor. His jacket, patched again at the shoulder, held the faint scent of salt and steel. To any outsider, he was just another civilian contractor on base. But the way people looked at him had changed. Tim Cole saw it first. That morning during a gear inspection, one of the newer recruits dropped a mag loader. Michael, passing by, picked it up and handed it over with a simple, "Keep your hand steady next time." The recruit, barely 22, and normally full of bravado, stammered, "Why, yes, sir." Then blinked in embarrassment. "Sorry, Sir Michael only gave a small nod and kept walking. Tim watched it all. It wasn't authority by rank. It was respect earned by presence. Later that afternoon, Tim caught up to him near the training docks. "You know they're looking into you," he said. Michael didn't pause. "They've always been looking." Tim hesitated. "The Admiral's taking it personally now." Michael gave a small, tired smile. "Good. That means he remembers. Remembers what Michael stopped. Turned. And for the first time in days, there was a fire behind his eyes. That some men, he said quietly, earn their rank by wearing it. Others earn it by living through things no medal can summarize. Tim said nothing. He understood. Not fully, but enough to know that Michael's presence on this base wasn't just a coincidence. It was a reckoning. That evening, back in the Admiral's office, the walls closed in tighter. The file on Michael Trace remained thin. Too thin. No deployment history. No discharge paperwork. No medical evaluations. Post-operation night candle. Keaton stared at the last line. Subject reassigned to confidential civilian status. Clearance level presidential. Presidential? His jaw clenched. What kind of man gets buried that deep? Then a new thought entered, darker, colder. What if Michael's not here to just work? What if he's watching me? His finger hovered over the intercom. "Captain Aldridge, get in here." A moment later, the base security officer entered. Keaton didn't look up. "Keep tabs on Trace. Don't approach him. Just report everything. Where he goes, who he talks to, especially if he's seen near the young recruits. Sir, respectfully. That might be a breach of protocol. He's classified. You don't Keaton cut him off. I know what he is. That's why I want eyes on him. Constantly." Aldridge hesitated. Understood. As the door closed, Keaton leaned back, eyes staring through the window out toward the ocean. If Michael Trace was here to take something from him, he was going to find out what, and stop it. No matter what it cost. But obsession has its price. 2 days later, during an evening PT session, Michael jogged past the recruits as they trained under sunset light. He kept his distance clipboard in hand, nodding once at the instructors. Tim Cole fell into step beside him. "They're watching you," he said under his breath. Michael smirked. "They always do until they stop pretending I'm invisible." "You think this is a game?" Tim asked. "No," Michael said, his tone sharpening. "I think this is a test. The same way they test metal under flame. See what bends. See what breaks." Tim studied him. "And what are you?" Michael glanced toward the horizon, the light of the setting sun glinting off his eyes. "I'm what's left after the breaking." Then he walked away, leaving Tim speechless. And behind them, on a distant balcony, Admiral Keaton stood in the shadows, binoculars lowered, watching every move, his obsession no longer hidden, but consuming. He didn't know what scared him more, that Michael Trace had returned, or that this time he wasn't leaving. The fire alarm screamed like a wounded animal. It pierced the late afternoon quiet, echoing through the concrete halls of the SEAL simulation facility. At first, no one moved, mistaking it for another drill. Then the second alarm triggered deeper and more urgent. Red strobes began to spin. Tim Cole dropped his training mat mid-stretch. Instructors shouted over the comms. Doors slammed open. Boots hit the floor like hammers. This wasn't a test. In the central training dome, a cavernous, hangar-sized room used for multivariable combat simulations, a dense column of black smoke coiled upward. It wasn't theatrical smoke, the kind pumped in to add realism. This was thick, acrid. Real. And something was wrong with the doors. The facility had several fire exit protocols, all reinforced with biometric redundancies. But now red lights blinked over every panel. System locked. Inside the dome, 6 SEAL recruits were trapped. One of them was Tim's bunkmate Ramirez. Another was a young man barely out of high school. They pounded on the glass partition, coughing, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The ventilation system was dead. The simulation fire meant to be contained had triggered a real spark near an electrical junction. A perfect storm of short-circuit failures and overlooked maintenance. Smoke billowed faster now. The heat was rising. From the hallway, instructors tried to override the system. Their keypads blinked red. Nothing worked. "Evac team is 10 minutes out," someone shouted. "We need to wait for emergency override?" "They don't have 10 minutes, Tim snapped. And then down the hall someone moved without permission. Michael Trace. He walked fast, not running, not flinching past the chaos and toward the fire-locked dome. He wore no gear, no radio, just his standard-issue boots and that same field jacket. Tim recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression he had when he dove into the ocean without hesitation. "Trace." "You can't go in," shouted a security officer. Michael didn't respond. He stopped in front of the emergency panel, knelt, and unscrewed the steel plate with a tool clipped to his belt. "Get him out of there," barked an instructor. But Michael was already pulling wires, rerouting current. His fingers moved with a surgeon's calm, deft, precise. Sparks flew. He ignored them. 5 seconds later, the inner lock clicked. "Override bypassed," someone whispered. Michael shoved the door open and stepped inside the black smoke. Inside the dome, it was hell. Visibility dropped to 3 feet. The air was dry and choking, like breathing through sandpaper soaked in gasoline. Through the haze, Michael could make out the blurry outlines of recruits, coughing on the floor, disoriented eyes watering. He didn't yell. He moved. One by one, he reached them. He used his jacket to shield the youngest recruit's face, lifted another onto his shoulder, dragged a third by the collar. He guided them by hand, by instinct. No hesitation. No wasted movement. Tim, watching from outside, could barely breathe himself. He counted each silhouette Michael brought through the smoke. 1, 2, 3. The 4th stumbled out gasping, then the 5th, only 1 left. Michael went back in. The dome groaned. Something overhead popped, metal warping in the heat. The lights flickered. Another alarm blared. "Call base med," someone shouted. "Where's Trace?" And then he appeared, emerging from the gray like a revenant from myth, carrying the final recruit in a fireman's hold, eyes locked forward. He stumbled only once, then kept walking. He crossed the threshold, handed the coughing recruit to the medics, and collapsed against the wall, his own lungs burning. Minutes later, as emergency crews swarmed in and instructors re-established systems, Michael sat on a steel bench near the back of the hall, a bottle of water in one hand, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He said nothing. No speeches, no declarations. The recruits he saved sat nearby, oxygen masks pressed to their faces, their wide, grateful eyes following Michael like compass needles drawn to true north. Tim Cole knelt beside him. "You saved them." Michael didn't look at him. "I just didn't wait." Tim swallowed. "You didn't have gear, or clearance, or backup." Michael's voice was quiet. "Smoke doesn't care about clearance." Behind them, Admiral Andrew Keaton stood in silence. He hadn't spoken a word since Michael stepped out of the fire. For the first time in decades, he didn't know what to say. What rattled him most wasn't that Michael had saved the recruits. It was the way everyone else had frozen, including himself. He was a 4-star admiral, but in the face of real crisis, it had been the man with the mop and clipboard who had run into the fire. And worse, he hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because it needed to be done. Later that evening, as the sun bled into the Pacific horizon, Tim found Michael alone in the mechanical yard, adjusting a water valve like it was any other day. Tim approached, slowly holding something. Michael looked up. Tim handed it to him, a small metal pin from the recruit's gear burnt at the edge, half melted. "Ramirez asked me to give this to you," Tim said. "Said he'd be dead if you hadn't gone in." Michael stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it into his pocket without a word. "You're not just a story anymore," Tim said softly. "They've seen you now. All of them." Michael exhaled, steady and slow. "Stories fade," he said. "Actions last." Up in his private office, Admiral Keaton watched the security footage again, frame by frame. Trace pulling open the panel, Trace walking into the smoke, Trace emerging with 6 men. No medals, no applause, no hesitation. Just action. Keaton poured a glass of scotch, but didn't drink it. He stared into the amber liquid haunted. He realized something with sudden bitter clarity. Michael Trace was everything he pretended to be. And that scared him more than any enemy ever had. The door closed behind Michael Trace with a finality that didn't just block out sound, it blocked out pretense. Inside Admiral Andrew Keaton's office, the light was dim. The blinds had been half drawn, letting in slivers of the Coronado sunset, slicing across the wood-paneled room like stripes on a prisoner's wall. The air smelled of leather polish and old tension. Michael stood still, his hands relaxed at his sides, jacket zipped halfway in the quiet habit of a man who didn't let the cold or heat dictate his comfort. Across the room, behind a wide desk, cluttered with unread reports and a half-empty tumbler of scotch, Admiral Keaton didn't rise. He just sat there, elbows on the armrests, fingers steepled under his chin. "You've made quite the impression," he said, after a long silence. Michael didn't reply. "I've had young SEALs request transfers," Keaton continued, "not away from the program into your orbit. They say things like, 'If he speaks, I'll listen. If he moves, I'll follow.' One called you the standard we're not being taught." His voice was calm, but beneath it lay a tremor, not of fear, but of something more dangerous for a man like Keaton: loss of control. Michael stepped forward once. "You asked to speak to me, sir." Keaton let out a breath, his composure thinning like old veneer. "You should have stayed buried." Michael tilted his head slightly. "Funny. I thought you liked ghosts. You kept one in your report file for 7 years. Keaton stood now, slowly, deliberately. He walked around the desk like a predator pretending not to hunt, then circled behind Michael and spoke low near his ear. "You think I don't know what you're doing. You show up here in that jacket like a monk with a scar. You fix a boat, dive into fire, walk out like some goddamn prophet. But I know what this is." Michael didn't flinch. "Then say it." Keaton circled in front of him again, eyes burning. "You want redemption. You want a legacy." Michael's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something colder. Clarity. "I already have a legacy," he said. "You're just afraid it's louder than yours." That landed like a blade between them. The Admiral's nostrils flared. "Watch your tone, Trace." "No, sir." Michael's voice was calm. "You don't get to ask for my tone. Not after the stunt in the dome. Not after you allowed that training exercise on the water. Not after you looked me in the eye and pretended not to know who I was." Keaton bristled. "You were supposed to disappear." "I did," Michael said quietly. "For 7 years. I gave you silence. I gave you distance. I even let you take credit for an extraction you never commanded. But I never gave you permission to rewrite history." The Admiral's face tightened. "You went off mission. You violated protocol. I covered for you because I owed you. But I'm still the one wearing the stars." Michael took a slow step forward. "And I'm the one who bled for them?" A silence stretched thick electric. Not a scream, not a threat. Just truth pressed between two men who had once shared a battlefield and now stood on opposite ends of legacy. Keaton turned away, poured himself another drink, and stared at the glass, as if the answer might be hiding in the amber. You could have had a desk job, training ops, a medal behind closed doors. Why come back here? Michael didn't answer at first. He looked around the office, the plaques, the flags, the photos of Keaton shaking hands with officials, a life documented in frames. Then he looked the Admiral dead in the eyes. Because the next generation deserves better than framed illusions. Keaton drank the scotch in one gulp. "Tell me," he said, wiping his mouth, "how long until you tell them everything?" Michael stared at him. "That depends. On what? On whether you keep pretending you were the hero." The room went still again. Keaton's shoulders sagged. Not much, but enough. He was a man beginning to realize that history once cracked could not be uncracked. Michael turned to leave, but at the door, Keaton spoke again. Not loud, not commanding, but uncertain. "Why didn't you expose me back then when the files were sealed?" When they gave you the chance, Michael paused, hand on the doorframe. His voice came low, gravel soft. "Because I didn't want to destroy a man to prove I existed." He looked over his shoulder. "But I won't let that man destroy others just to stay relevant." And then he was gone. Keaton stood in the middle of the room alone now, the scotch burning at the back of his throat. The air was heavy with failure. He couldn't name a kind of defeat that came not from losing a war, but from watching truth rise like dawn, slow and inevitable. He looked at the door Michael had walked through and saw not a ghost, but a mirror. Down on the training field, Tim Cole saw Michael walking across the asphalt, steady head held level like always. But something in his step had changed. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was acceptance. Michael had faced the man who tried to bury him, and hadn't needed to raise his voice to rise. The desert doesn't remember your name. It forgets your footsteps before your boots lift off the sand. It swallows screams. It hides blood under the heat. And it keeps secrets for the ones who never ask to be thanked. 7 years ago in a place no one on base was allowed to mention. Michael Trace stood in the shadow of a crumbling stone wall, one hand pressed to a radio that hissed static, the other tightening the tourniquet on a bleeding seal's leg. Smoke coiled above the compound. Admiral Andrew Keaton, then Commander Keaton, lay semi-conscious nearby, a bullet graze across his temple. He was one of 5 pinned down after a classified hostage extraction had gone catastrophically wrong. The chopper never came. The local team folded. Backup never existed. Only Michael Trace came, and no one knew how. He wasn't assigned to the mission. He wasn't even in country officially. But when comms failed, and the higher-ups wrote the mission off as high-risk, low survivability, Michael slipped through a back channel. Unarmed, unrecognized, unforgiven. They called it Operation Night Candle. But to Michael, it was just the night 5 men he'd trained with were left to die. He pulled them out one by one under moonlight, crawled through glass and dust, used a broken mirror to reflect signal light toward a Turkish patrol that never saw him. He carried Keaton on his back for 3 miles before a stolen jeep found them. No cameras, no intel crew, just blood and boots and grit. At the exfil site, Michael refused medical evacuation. He handed Keaton off to the medics, saluted, and vanished into the dunes before sunrise. They didn't see him again. Not until now. Present day. Tim Cole sat in the low-lit corner of the base archive room, fingers trembling slightly over the keyboard. He wasn't supposed to be here. The login credentials had been borrowed technically from a sympathetic comms officer who once served with Michael. He'd dug for a week, chased declassified scraps, triangulated timelines. And then, like a ghost emerging from smoke, he found it. A 3-sentence footnote in a file about an abandoned rescue in Syria, subject of extraction A. Keaton 5 others, rescued by unknown operator. Survivors refused to confirm identity. Operation sealed at level 7 upon return. Operator vanished. No name, no medal, no credit. Tim leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The implications were clear. Now Michael Trace had saved Admiral Andrew Keaton's life, and Keaton had kept it quiet. Tim didn't know whether to feel rage or awe. He looked at the file again. One part stood out. Survivors refused to confirm identity. Refused, or were told not to. He glanced at the office window. The sun was setting. Michael would be back at the tool depot soon. And Tim had questions. An hour later, near the motor pool, Michael leaned under a Humvee's chassis, replacing a cracked serpentine belt. His hands were dark with oil, his expression unreadable as always. Tim approached slowly. "I know," he said softly. Michael didn't move. "Know what I found, the report. Syria. Night candle. You pulled him out." Michael stayed silent, still half buried under the vehicle. "You saved the Admiral's life," Tim said again, firmer. "And he let them bury you." Michael rolled out from under the Humvee, wiped his hands with a rag, finally looked at the young recruit. "He didn't let them." "I did." Tim blinked. What Michael leaned against the truck arms folded. "They offered me a medal, a retirement ceremony. Said I could write a book if I wanted. But I told them no." "Why?" Tim asked, nearly angry. "You earned it." Michael's voice was quiet. "Not everything that's earned should be displayed." Tim shook his head. "You could have had everything rank glory recognition." Michael looked him in the eyes. "I had 5 brothers. They came home alive. That's everything." The silence between them was thick. Tim finally asked, "So why come here?" "Why now?" Michael exhaled long and slow. "Because I heard Keaton was rewriting history, turning legacy into theater. And I thought, maybe it's time someone reminded them what the truth looks like." Tim hesitated, then held out a small object, a dog tag he'd recovered from the archives long filed under unknown operator. Michael took it, brushed his thumb across the name, Trace M. No rank, no unit, no date. Just a name and silence. That night, Admiral Keaton sat alone in the strategy room, watching the footage from the fire rescue again, not for analysis, but for penance. Michael Trace had done what no man in his position should ever have needed to do. And still, he hadn't demanded anything in return. Keaton set down his drink, stared at his own reflection in the black screen, and whispered, "You never told them." And that was when he knew he'd lost. Not because the base now followed Michael's footsteps. Not because the recruits looked to him for quiet guidance, but because Michael had already won the only way that mattered in silence, through sacrifice and without expectation. The next morning, Tim stood in front of his unit as they prepared for an advanced navigation course. He wore a small, respectful patch on his sleeve, not standard issue. Just 2 initials sewn in black IG Iron Ghost. No one asked what it meant, but everyone who saw it stood a little straighter. And up in the watchtower, Michael watched them march a new generation, knowing they didn't need to know everything. They just needed to walk with integrity. The base cafeteria was almost empty. It was the quiet hour between night drills and lights out. The coffee machine hissed in the corner, half cleaned. A single fluorescent bulb flickered above, casting long shadows across empty tables. Tim Cole sat alone near the far wall, staring at his untouched cup of black coffee. Steam curled upward, ghost-like. The folder on the table in front of him was thin, but heavy. Inside were printouts, screenshots, and handwritten notes. The sealed line from Operation Night Candle. A record of Admiral Keaton's commendation. A blank personnel slot where Michael's name should have been. A signed witness statement from one of the rescued SEALs, no longer active duty, confirming Michael Trace by name. Evidence, enough to crack the illusion wide open. He didn't know how it had landed on his bunk that morning. A blank manila envelope. No note, no fingerprints, just truth. Truth that could destroy a career, and possibly a command. Tim leaned back, exhausted. He wasn't a rebel. He hadn't joined the Navy to expose anyone. He'd joined to become part of something greater, to learn to serve, to belong. But now the very institution that had trained him to value honor above all else was forcing him to ask what happens when honor and obedience point in opposite directions. Down the hall in the barracks, the whispers had shifted. Michael Trace wasn't just a legend anymore. He was real. And he was here. Even the instructors had stopped calling him contractor. Some of the more seasoned ones nodded when he passed a small, respectful acknowledgement from men who had seen things and recognized others who had survived them. But no one dared say what they were all thinking. If Michael Trace was just a janitor, then why was the Admiral looking more nervous each day? Why had the cameras in Michael's work zone been disabled for maintenance? Why had the Admiral ordered a morale reshuffle among the SEAL candidates, one that conveniently placed Tim on desk duty? That evening, Tim walked toward the administrative wing, the manila folder under his arm. The hallway was dim quiet, the kind of silence you get before a verdict. Admiral Keaton's office was at the end, a dull gold plaque, a locked door. Tim stood in front of it for a long time, the folder growing heavier in his hands by the second. He could hand it over. He could walk in salute and say, "Sir, we need to talk about Michael Trace," and it would all come crashing down. Keaton's reputation, his command, his legacy. But would the truth be served or just weaponized? Would Michael want that? Tim turned and walked back down the hallway fast. He found Michael in the empty gym alone on the mat, running slow stretches through what looked like a mix of SEAL calisthenics and old martial arts movements. He wasn't showing off, just moving like a man whose body remembered things his mind didn't need to explain anymore. Michael glanced up as Tim approached, then stood wiping his face with a towel. Tim held up the folder. "I got this anonymously." Michael looked at it but didn't reach for it. "It's all in here," Tim said. "The proof, witness testimony, your name, the redactions, even Keaton's falsified commendation." Michael still didn't move, and Tim hesitated. "I'm bringing it to command, the real one, not Keaton." Michael's eyes met his calm, steady. "You don't need my permission." "I'm not asking for permission," Tim replied. "I'm asking if it's right." That stopped Michael, just for a second. He walked over to the edge of the mat and sat on the bench, took a sip of water, then finally spoke. "Let me tell you something about truth," he said. "It doesn't shine. It doesn't make speeches. Most of the time it just waits, quietly, until someone's strong enough to carry it." Tim sat across from him, the folder between them like a loaded weapon. Michael continued. "If you're asking whether exposing him would be justified, yes. If you're asking whether it would serve justice, maybe. But if you're asking whether it would change anything about me, the answer is no." Tim swallowed hard. "But he buried you." "No," Michael said. "I buried myself. I let him walk because I didn't want to spend my life chasing spotlights. I chose peace, quiet, service." He leaned forward, voice lower now. "But you're young. You're still choosing what kind of man you want to be. Tim looked down at the folder. I don't want revenge, he said quietly. Then don't take it, Michael replied. Take responsibility. The next morning, Tim walked to command. The folder was gone. In its place, he carried a single-page memo, unsigned, unmarked, stating, "There exists classified evidence that contradicts recent personnel citations. Recommend internal ethics review without external exposure. Protect integrity and those who have quietly upheld it." He submitted it anonymously. No headlines, no scandal. But a ripple was set in motion. And somewhere in the chain of command, eyes opened. Later that week, during a leadership workshop, Michael Trace was asked unofficially to sit in and observe. Not instruct, not advise. Just be present. As he stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the next generation speak about purpose and loyalty, he felt something shift. Tim Cole stood in front of his peers and said, "Leadership isn't rank, it's action. It's knowing when to speak and when to stand quietly beside someone who has already done more than enough." Michael didn't smile, but he stayed. The morning air was still unusually so, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Rows of white folding chairs lined the open-air courtyard at Coronado Naval Base. Banners fluttered above call sign recognition ceremony, Class 439. Polished boots shined in perfect symmetry. Dress uniforms snapped taut with starch. Behind the podium stood a massive steel insignia of the Navy SEAL Trident, sharp, unyielding, eternal. It was the most formal event of the cycle. The day when each graduating SEAL candidate would receive the call sign earned through months of sweat, sand, cold water, and near breakdown. It was a moment of identity, a rite of passage, and this year the Admiral would be speaking personally. But he wasn't the only one being watched. At the far edge of the courtyard, behind the rows of families, officers and photographers, stood a man in an olive-green field jacket. No rank, no seat, no spotlight. Just a clipboard, under one arm, like always. Michael Trace. He leaned quietly against the shade of a concrete pillar, arms crossed, not intending to stay long. But he stayed. Because Tim Cole would be walking across that stage. And something about today felt unfinished. Up on the platform, Admiral Andrew Keaton scanned the audience as the ceremony began. His expression was composed, almost warm, but underneath his pulse throbbed like a war drum. He spotted Michael. Of course he did. They hadn't spoken since their confrontation in the office. No more words had passed between them, but words were no longer necessary. The real battlefield was now. Keaton stepped up to the microphone. The murmuring crowd quieted. "Today we honor a tradition older than the steel we train with," he began. "The call sign. It's not just a nickname. It's a reflection of your conduct under pressure, of how others see you when things fall apart." He let the silence sit. For some, that call sign marks your loudest moment. For others, your quietest. Tim Cole sat in the second row of recruits. His hands were steady, his posture perfect, but his eyes were fixed on Michael Trace in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. Then the roll call began. Names were called. Applause followed. One by one, candidates stepped forward to receive their new identity. Blazer, Scorpion, Atlas, Juke. Some smiled. Some saluted with tears in their eyes. Their families snapped photos, beamed with pride. And then came the final name. Cole Timothy. Tim rose. Walked. Every step felt like a drumbeat inside his chest. He approached the podium, stood at attention, and saluted. Admiral Keaton nodded. "You've demonstrated excellence under pressure. Leadership without shouting. Courage in silence." Then, without turning, he read from the card in front of him. "Your call sign is Echo." Tim blinked. then nodded. It fit. He stepped back, but Keaton didn't move on. Instead, he turned, slightly facing the recruits again. The crowd hushed. Something was coming. Something unwritten. "There is one more name I wish to recognize today," he said slowly. Murmurs rippled. Tim froze in place. Michael didn't move, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. Keaton continued, voice calm. "This individual is not part of the graduating class. Not officially. Not anymore. But he holds a call sign known in corners of the world we never talk about. In missions, we never declassify." He paused, letting the silence grow. "In my early career, I was part of an operation gone wrong. Extraction failed. Backup lost. Every protocol shredded. I wouldn't be here today, none of us would, if not for the actions of one man who had no orders and no obligation to save us. A beat, his call sign, was Iron Ghost." Now the courtyard truly fell silent. You could hear the flags flap. The name had been whispered for weeks but never spoken publicly until now. Keaton's jaw flexed. His throat worked. "Michael Trace," he said quietly. "If you're present, would you please step forward?" Every head turned. At the back, Michael stood completely still. For a moment, it looked as if he might walk away. That would have been fitting. His entire life had been a study in retreating from the spotlight. But today, he moved. One step, then another. The crowd parted like waves. No applause, no cheering, just reverence. Michael walked with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove and had proven everything anyway. His jacket was faded, his boots unshined, but no one could look away. He reached the base of the stage and looked up at Keaton. No salute, no smile. Keaton met his gaze, and for the first time in public, the Admiral's voice cracked. "Call sign Iron Ghost, for actions beyond valor, for a legacy that trained warriors long before we knew his name." He extended a hand. Michael didn't take it. Instead, he looked out at the sea of recruits at the next generation. Then he said simply, "Don't chase names. Earn them." With that, he turned and walked away. No medal, no plaque. Just a legacy passed in silence. Tim Cole stood at attention as Michael passed by. Their eyes met for just a second. A nod, a promise. And Tim understood what had really happened today. Michael hadn't accepted a title. He'd passed it on. The silence didn't break all at once. It held like the final breath before an anthem, heavy, sacred. Michael Trace had just walked away from the stage, his simple words, "Don't chase names," earned them still hanging in the air like mist over morning surf. But something in that courtyard had shifted. The recruits, the instructors, even the senior officers weren't moving. They were watching. Not the podium. Not the flags. Him. Michael made it halfway back to the edge of the crowd when a single voice rang out. I was there. The voice came from the third row, gravel-worn and sharp. A man in civilian clothes stood up slowly, gray at the temples, shoulders still squared like a soldier's. Michael stopped. Turned. "I was one of the 5, the man said louder now. "Syria. Night candle. You pulled me from the rubble with half your arm bleeding and carried me 2 clicks to evac." Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Admiral Keaton didn't move. The man stepped forward, voice steady despite the tremor in his throat. "I remember your face. I never forgot it. We were ordered not to speak your name. We obeyed. I regret that." He came to full attention. Then, he saluted. Michael didn't respond, but a second man stood up. Then a third, this one in uniform. Then a fourth, his face lined with age and memory. All of them survivors. All of them men who had once vanished from the record books, saved by a ghost. One by one, they stepped forward. and one by one they saluted Michael Trace. No music played, no command was given. But across the courtyard others began to rise. Recruits, instructors, officers, even civilians who didn't know what exactly was happening, only that they were witnessing something holy. Tim Cole stood too, his chest pounding. He walked past, his row moved to where Michael stood, and with quiet conviction raised his right hand, not to salute, to speak. "This man is not a myth," he said, voice clear. "He's not a story. He's not a legend." He looked around the crowd. "He's a man who chose to serve in silence, who carried the lives of others on his back, and who never asked to be thanked. But today, we thank him." And then, as if pulled by gravity, the entire courtyard stood. Hundreds of people shoulder to shoulder, rising for a man who had once been forgotten. Michael's jaw clenched, his eyes wet with the pressure of emotion he refused to show. He hadn't come for this. He didn't want this. But the truth had finally become too heavy for silence to hold. Admiral Keaton slowly stepped forward from the platform. His posture had changed, no longer rigid, no longer regal. Something inside him had given way. He stood before Michael. "I wanted to bury it," Keaton said, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Because I didn't know how to live in a world where you were the real measure." Michael said nothing. Keaton swallowed hard, then dropped his voice further. "I was wrong." He extended his hand again. And this time, Michael took it. Not in surrender, not in friendship, but in quiet, final acknowledgement of a truth that had long deserved daylight. Applause didn't erupt, not right away. It rose slowly like a wave coming in from the horizon. No one clapped fast. No one shouted. They honored him with the kind of reverence reserved not for celebrities, but for truth made flesh. And Michael Trace, for the first time in years, stood in it, not as a ghost, not as a janitor, not as a mystery, but as a man who had endured and who had never once stopped serving. Later that afternoon, the courtyard emptied. But Michael didn't leave right away. He sat alone at the edge of the training field, where new recruits were already beginning prep for the next rotation. He watched them with quiet eyes. They reminded him of himself a long time ago, all sharp edges and loud ambition. Tim joined him holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one over. "They won't forget today," Tim said. Michael took a sip, didn't answer. After a pause, Tim added, "Neither will I." Michael finally spoke. The name didn't matter. "No," Tim said, but the man behind it did. Michael looked at the field again. "I didn't want this." "I know," Tim said. "That's why you earned it." Up in the command tower, Admiral Keaton stood with hands behind his back, watching the same field. But this time, there was no bitterness. Just clarity. He whispered to himself as if reading from an old line of scripture. "The strongest men are those who carry others without leaving footprints." And for the first time in a long time, he no longer feared the shadow of Iron Ghost. He stood in its light. It rained the next morning. Not a storm, just a steady, dignified drizzle. The kind that softened hard edges and made the world seem quieter. The flags on base fluttered without snapping. Recruits moved through their drills in respectful silence. Even the Pacific, usually restless, rolled gently against the shore, as if it too had taken a breath. Inside the main command building, Admiral Andrew Keaton stood at the window, staring out through the rain-streaked glass. His uniform was pressed, his medals aligned. But he looked smaller than usual. Not in stature, in weight. Like something heavy had been lifted, and what remained was a man stripped down to truth. He hadn't slept much. Not since the ceremony. Not since he said it out loud. Iron Ghost. He never imagined how right it would feel to finally say the name, and how much it would cost. Down in the maintenance bay, Michael Trace was back on duty. Same jacket, same boots, same calm. He moved through his tasks as if nothing had changed, inspecting fuel pumps, updating supply logs, replacing a cracked water line. But there was a quiet reverence wherever he went now. Officers didn't look through him anymore. Recruits greeted him like they would a respected elder, no longer with curiosity but with clarity, and he accepted it without comment. Because it wasn't admiration he'd wanted, it was understanding, and he finally had it. At noon, Michael was called into the Admiral's office. No one ordered him, no one threatened. The message had come on a slip of paper delivered by Tim, who had simply said, "He wants to talk." That's all. Michael walked the halls slowly, his boots echoing through spaces that had once ignored him. Now they recognized his presence like gravity, unspoken but undeniable. He entered the office without knocking. Keaton was already standing. They faced each other without salute, without ceremony. Only truth remained between them now. "I resigned this morning," Keaton said. Voice even. Effective end of quarter. Michael blinked but didn't react. Voluntarily, Keaton gave a short nod. "It's time. The Navy deserves leaders who don't spend their careers managing ghosts." A pause. "I don't want a medal," Michael said quietly. "You're not getting one," Keaton replied. Then, after a beat, added, "because anything I'd give you would only diminish what you did." He walked around the desk and extended a plain, unmarked envelope. Michael took it. Inside was a copy of the declassified mission record from Operation Night Candle. Unredacted. His name in black ink. Official. Permanent. "It's already been uploaded to the archive," Keaton said. "The next time someone searches for Iron Ghost, they won't find a rumor. They'll find a man." Michael looked down at the paper. His name had always been enough for him. But something about seeing it acknowledged finally without asterisks or silence settled something in his chest. He folded the envelope and placed it in his jacket. Keaton exhaled. "You could have ruined me." "I still could," Michael said, not unkindly. "But you didn't," Keaton finished. Silence settled again, heavier than rain. Then Michael asked the question he hadn't let himself say for 7 years. "Why did you let them erase me?" Keaton's shoulders sank, not in defense, in regret. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that if they saw you, they'd stop seeing me. I let my fear of being forgotten turn into dishonesty, and I told myself it was for national security, for mission integrity, for peace. But it wasn't." He looked up. It was for pride. Michael nodded once. "Then you've answered everything I needed." He turned to go, but Keaton called after him. "Trace." Michael paused in the doorway. "Can you forgive me?" Michael didn't turn, but his voice was clear. It was never about forgiveness. It was about whether you'd own the truth when it finally arrived. Then he left. Outside, Tim Cole waited in the hallway. Michael handed him the envelope. Tim opened it, scanned the lines, then looked up, eyes wide. "It's real." Michael nodded. "Now you know the rest?" Tim held the paper like something sacred. "They'll study this someday. You know that, right? They'll teach this in ethics and leadership courses." Michael smiled faintly. "They shouldn't teach me. They should teach you." "Why?" "Because you saw the truth and didn't weaponize it. You respected it." Tim didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I think you're the only person I've ever met who got stronger by staying invisible." Michael put a hand on his shoulder. "Invisibility isn't weakness, it's discipline." That evening, a quiet dinner was held for the outgoing Admiral. No press, no headlines, just a few commanders, instructors, and staff. Michael didn't attend, but he stood outside near the base gate, watching from a distance as the lights inside the mess hall flickered across the windows. He didn't need closure. He already had it. Later, under a sky just beginning to clear, Michael walked alone along the beach trail. Each step crunched over gravel and sand. He could smell salt and wood smoke. The horizon was a soft blur of gold and gray. He didn't think about missions or medals. He thought about peace, and about what it meant to leave behind not a name, but a standard. As he rounded the bend, a new sign came into view, freshly mounted on a small plaque near the training path. It read, "In honor of those who serve in silence, dedicated to all unnamed operators whose actions saved lives and whose humility became legacy. Iron Ghost Memorial Trail." Michael stopped. No name, just a shadow and the truth behind it. And somehow it was perfect. He smiled, then walked on, not toward the past, but into the soft light of whatever would come next. 1 month later. The sun crested the edge of the Pacific like a slow exhale, casting warm gold across the Coronado base. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries softened by the morning tide. The compound stirred with the low hum of a new cycle boots, hitting pavement flags, rising orders being barked into the wind. But something was different now. A new program was launching, quietly, without ceremony. It had no formal name, yet just an internal designation, Seal Shadow Mentorship Initiative. And at the heart of it stood a man who once carried a mop and clipboard, and who now walked the grounds not as a myth, but as a teacher. Michael Trace. He stood at the edge of the training field in his uniform jacket, still olive green, still weathered, but with a small patch sewn over the heart, a minimalist insignia shaped like a stylized ghost folded into a seal trident. No words, just symbol. Beside him stood Timothy Cole, now assigned as assistant instructor to the inaugural class of the mentorship program. He wore a crisp utility uniform, but the fire in his eyes had matured. Less eager, now, more grounded, like a young tree that had grown deep roots overnight. Michael looked out across the field. A dozen candidates, male and female, stood at attention. Not fresh recruits, but select individuals from different branches invited to this new kind of training. One focused not on bravado or brute strength, but on principled endurance, on tactical humility, on the power of silence under pressure. He turned to Tim. "You ready?" Tim smirked. "You're asking me? You're the ghost." Michael shook his head. "Not anymore. Ghosts vanish. I'm still here." He stepped forward. The candidates didn't salute him. That wasn't part of this program. Instead, they stood still and listened. Michael looked each one in the eye before speaking. "You weren't chosen for how loud you are. You're here because someone noticed what you didn't say, because you stayed calm when others shouted, because you moved when others froze, and because you showed integrity when no one was watching." He paused, letting that settle like a stone in water. "This program isn't about recognition. It's about responsibility. You won't leave here famous, but if you do this right, you'll leave here unforgettable." The wind stirred gently. Somewhere far off, a gull cried. Michael stepped back. "Tim, you're up." Tim nodded and addressed the group. His voice was steady. "We'll start with endurance tracking, then observation drills. But before that," he gestured toward the trailhead behind them. 3 miles. No time cap, no packs, just awareness. The candidates dispersed, jogging toward the trail, their footfalls rhythmic and light. Michael and Tim watched them go. "You ever think you'd be back in uniform?" Tim asked. Michael glanced down at his jacket. "It's not the uniform that matters. It's what you carry in it." Tim grinned. "That sounds like something I'll be stealing in a speech." Michael chuckled. "Just spell my name right." Later that afternoon, as the day waned and shadows stretched long across the training field, Michael sat alone near the memorial trail marker. The small plaque, placed discreetly by the base director, now bore fresh flowers, a sign someone had passed by earlier and paused long enough to honor what couldn't be captured in stone. A soft voice broke the silence behind him. "You look better in the sun." Michael turned. Admiral Andrew Keaton stood there, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, sleeves rolled hat in hand. He looked lighter, not because he had shed power, but because he'd released the part of himself that once feared truth. Michael gave him a small nod. "You staying in town a few more weeks," Keaton said, "helping with the transition, consulting." He looked toward the trail. "They asked me to write a foreword for the new ethics training module," he added. Michael raised an eyebrow. You Keaton smiled without irony. "Apparently there's value in admitting your worst decisions before others make them." Michael nodded slowly. "That I believe." They sat together for a moment. Two soldiers, two histories, one future. Keaton finally stood to leave. "If you ever want to speak at Annapolis." Michael waved him off with a half smile. "Let's not ruin the curriculum." They both laughed, and in that laughter, there was healing. Keaton offered his hand again, not out of formality this time, but friendship. Michael took it. This time, they both held on for a moment longer. That night, as the stars began to pierce the Navy sky, Michael stood outside the barracks watching the lights flicker off one by one. The recruits were sleeping now, or trying to. Tim stepped out onto the porch beside him. "Long day," he said. Michael nodded. "Longer road ahead." "You worried?" Michael looked up at the stars. "No," he said. "I've walked through darker." Then he paused, adding, "The only thing I worry about now is whether we're leaving something behind that's worth carrying forward." Tim looked out across the base. "You already have." Michael didn't reply. He just watched the horizon, not waiting for anything, not chasing anything, just being. The wind brushed gently across his face. Somewhere deep in the compound, a chime rang. Midnight. A new day had begun. We'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Your stories, your presence, they mean more than you know. And if this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more heartfelt tales of courage, kindness, and quiet heroes. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay well, stay kind, and never underestimate the power of a quiet soul.